Hi, and welcome to Oddly Specific, a new show that covers everything from private equity to Pete Davidson. I'm your host, Meredith Lynch, and I am so excited for this episode, y'all. We have the hilarious comedian and writer Christina Tucci in the house. She's going to help me unpack a lesser known pop song from the early 2000s. But my first guest, Michael Fenney, is here from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project for a conversation about the industry, in particular, the ways in which private equity is affecting the prison system here in the United States. I'm really excited to have this conversation and to share it with all of you. Michael, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I love talking about private equity.
I do also. I love having new people learn about private equity and being able to, expose new people to it and have new people to think about private equity with in discussion.
If you go to a party and you say to someone, I work for PESP, Private Equity Stakeholder Project, what is like the next question normally?
What is private equity is the first question. I've tried to answer this many times and try to make it as easy to understand. So private equity firms basically are investment firms that buy companies and then manage the company for a number of years before they sell it. They're an investment firm, so they get their money from investors, pension funds, endowments, and that's where they get the money to make these purchases. A couple of things that may clarify what private equity is as opposed to other types of investments. So the private in private equity is because the companies that private equity firms buy are on the private market. You can't buy them. You can't buy shares on the stock exchange. These are companies that don't really have the same kind of regulatory and reporting requirements that public companies have. And then another maybe thing to clarify is venture capital and private equity are both forms of private capital, but they come into the picture at different stages of when a company exists. So venture capital is likely to give seed money to a company that's younger, that's trying to grow. Private equity firms will buy companies that may have existed already for a few years, have matured and developed, and have kind of existing revenue model to go on. Private equity comes in and says, we're going to buy this. We think we can make it more efficient. And what that means is more profit. So fewer expenses and then more income is what they're going for usually when they buy these companies. One more thing, they normally own companies for 3 to 7 years. So they're trying to do all of this in a really short amount of time.
Sure.
And
so if someone says to you, oh, that's so interesting that you say this because my company actually just got bought by private equity. They're at this party with you. What would your next line be?
I would ask them when it happened and then if they've noticed any changes since the company was bought by private equity. They buy the company and then, like I said, they make it more efficient. So workers may experience their hours get cut. They may have staff may get there may be fewer staff on certain shifts. They may have less access to certain resources that they would have had previously. I think about in the medical context specifically, sometimes private equity firms, hospitals that are owned by private equity firms, there have been recent reports of people who weren't able to get the care they needed because there just weren't the appropriate medical supplies at the location.
And we have seen that the quality of care and the outcome of patients is lower at private equity owned hospitals. Is that correct?
There are a few studies that suggest that once a hospital has been acquired by a private equity firm, that outcomes for patients do tend to get worse, yes.
Now, if you go into your local emergency room, you might not know this, but it actually might be owned by private equities. That's what I've been told. Is that correct?
That's correct. Or it could be that the people working in that emergency room are working for a staffing company that is owned by a private equity firm.
Would you say private equity is sneaky?
I would say they are sneaky. I think that private equity is everywhere in our lives. It could be in our healthcare provisions, in your landlord could be a private equity owned by a private equity firm, oil pipelines and production facilities, farms, veterinary clinics, hotels, pretty much anything that can be bought, any company, they're there. And I think that you're right to say that they're sneaky because a lot of this is just not discussed, and they
Right.
often don't disclose that they're the owners of companies. So you don't find out unless you're actually looking for it,
Right.
or somebody tells you, or they report on it themselves.
Yeah. So a lot of times people, I think when it comes to hospitals, they'll find out when they get a bill, right? They'll get some bill that doesn't make sense. And then they end up starting to kind of dig around. And then they end up finding out that the, emergency room they went to is actually owned by private equity.
There was some legislation that addressed that. The No Surprises Act made it so that emergency rooms couldn't do surprise billing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was actually in response in part to private equity firms.
Wow.
Private equity firms were the primary parties doing the surprise billing.
Sure.
And then when the legislation was proposed, there were two private equity backed companies that were the main funders for a lobbying group opposed to that legislation. And now that it's been passed, there's a new process for out of network billing.
Okay.
And I don't know too much about it yet.
Okay.
But most of the claims that are being filed through it are involved with private equity.
Okay.
They're kind of overwhelming this dispute system that the federal government has set up for to settle these types of claims.
So it kind of shows you who the problem is with the surprise billing.
Yeah. Because they were the original problem, and then now that there's this legislation that's addressed it, they are still using this surprise billing model to get more profits.
Yeah. So your organization, Private Equity Stakeholder Project, PESP, what do you do to push back against private equity?
We respond to the sneakiness. We try to bring light where there is none. So private equity is opaque. It's not very transparent, and it's hard to find information about it. So what we try to do is find the information that's out there. It could be through public filing or through regulatory filings. Sometimes they disclose information. There are lawsuits where you can find information about these firms. It's very piecemeal. And so what we try to do is put together reports and research that bring more light to what these private equity firms are doing across different areas. We have teams that work in housing, healthcare, climate, and labor and jobs. And each of these teams has exposed private equity's presence in the economy when before there just wasn't any knowledge about what they're doing. Our healthcare team has a tracker of hospitals. There are about 460 hospitals owned by private equity firms. Our climate team is looking at fossil fuel infrastructure that's owned by private equity firms, so pipelines and production facilities. Our housing team looks at what landlords and single-family homeowner, like big companies that buy homes, what they're doing. And then our labor team also just looks at pretty much anything where people work, hotels, food processing facilities, retail. And we try to just bring attention to what's happening, because sometimes you may see a company has done something, has a lawsuit against it, but you don't know that it's connected to this investment firm that owns the company that's putting financial pressure on the company to cut costs and to get their profits up.
Well, I think that brings us to a good part that I want to talk about. I want to talk about some of the work that PESP has done around the intersection of private equity and the prison system here in the United States. You put together this incredible, is it zine or is it zine?
We've been saying it's zine.
It must be zine because it's like magazine, right?
Right.
Okay, so it's zine. You put together a zine. It's called From Dusk Till Dawn, and it's about the ways in which private equity might show up at a typical day in a prison here in the United States. And it's everything from, the communications to food service to, employees of the prison. And one of the things I want to stress is that a lot of people will say to me when I say, private equity in prisons, like, oh, yes, of course, the privatization of prisons is terrible. Private prisons are awful. Now, private equity exists in both public and private prisons because a lot of these public federally run prisons actually outsource things to private equity. So just because a prison is not a private prison does not mean that there is not private equity there. Correct?
Correct.
Right. Okay. So there's that. But I want to just talk for a second about what some of the statistics that I have found, or I would say it's more so the ways in which private equity is showing up in these prisons. Excuse me. there is a private equity firm called HIG Capital, and they own something called TKC Holdings that provides commissary and food service to many prisons here in the United States. Okay. And from what I read, there have been cases of mold and maggots in the food,
Hmm.
and that incarcerated individuals are 6.4 times more likely to get ill from contaminated or spoiled food. So, this is not great quality. And how do you think that is connected back to private equity? Because one might argue, oh, well, that's just because it's prisons and they just don't get the best food.
I think it ties to the sneakiness, the working in the shadows that you talk about, because you don't get a lot of good attention by providing poor services
Mhm.
in a correctional facility. And so these firms have, like you said, they're in public prisons. There's a broader effort to get rid of private prisons,
Mhm.
but that's only a small part of the people who
Right.
are affected. It's
Right?
a much larger amount of people who are impacted by the food that they get in a prison. And yeah, these firms, I think that they benefit because also the prison, it's not, there's not a lot of attention put on it, and then there's
Right.
not a lot of regulation,
Right.
or there it's hard to get accountability for
Totally.
companies in prisons, especially because the people most affected are people who are incarcerated and their families. And so if you're incarcerated, it's already difficult to, you don't have a political voice, and then also you have to overcome these legal hurdles to even get your voice heard in court.
So, one of the other things that I saw, another really interesting statistic is that, TKC Holdings has the commissary in the prisons and they mark up the prices of things. So, a tube of toothpaste at Walmart will cost $1.50, and at the commissary in the prison it will be $3.50. So putting this unnecessary burden on folks who already don't have a lot of means and don't have a lot of access and don't have the opportunity to like go out and comparison shop, right?
Right.
The private equity firm sees the bottom line of that markup. I would argue, right? And says, "Okay, well, here's what we can do. They have no other choice. We can throw this price on it."
And that applies for the food. It applies for all the services that you get in prison, because for healthcare also there aren't a lot of options other than the
Right.
private equity firm. And
Mhm.
then yeah, it's just either the quality goes down, but people aren't listening to people who are incarcerated. And then also there may be a benefit to the county or the state that's contracting with the company itself. They may get a kickback from the commissary. So they have an incentive there also.
Sure. That brings me to WellPath, which is the a healthcare provider that is also owned by HIG Capital, and they are one of the largest healthcare providers in prisons. And they have a well documented history of denial of care, inadequate staffing. I was reading about an individual who was awaiting trial and needed a CPAP machine that was requested and not provided, and that person did end up passing away. So there is a lot of documented history that WellPath has not provided adequate care. Recently, Elizabeth Warren has been, working with members of Congress to try to get WellPath to answer some questions. And so I was going through these letters, and I'll link them in the show notes, but back on December 18th, Senator Warren, Senator Markey, a few other senators sent a very detailed letter to WellPath and said, "Hey, we have all these questions. Please answer them. Where are you actually? Where are you actually located? How many prisons are you working in?" All these kind of things. And WellPath responded about a month later, and they didn't actually answer the questions. How common is something like that?
Private equity firms will let you know as much as they are legally required to let you know, and no more, in my experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so they weren't required to provide that information, and provided probably just enough to say that they've responded to these questions. I saw that in the end of the letter, they're like, let's continue this dialogue. Private equity firms are pretty secretive about what companies they own and what those companies are doing. And so unless you have to disclose that for any legal reason, then they will keep that to themselves unless it benefits them to get that information out there. And for companies that are working in prisons, especially with the documented history of WellPath, my guess is that they want as little information out there about that as possible.
Okay. Yes, I personally have been trying to get in touch with HIG Capital and find out a little bit more about why TKC Holdings is not listed on their website. WellPath is listed on the website. I think it's probably pretty hard for them to deny at this point with all the documentation. So I've contacted them and asked, could you just confirm for me that you own TKC Holdings? And they just, I talked to someone on the phone. They gave me a contact. They won't answer my emails. And I guess, if Senator Warren can't get an answer, probably Meredith Lynch isn't going to get an answer either. But all of that to say is, if these were publicly traded companies, would there be more accountability?
There would be much more accountability. If they were publicly traded companies, they would have regulatory requirements they'd have to abide by. They would have to file regular reporting of their finances on a quarterly and annual basis. These things just don't exist for private equity firms. It's near impossible to know for sure what companies. You said HIG has WellPath on their website,
Yes.
but not TKC. Yeah, they will list their portfolio companies on their website, and sometimes the private equity firms could own 100, 200 companies across many different areas, but they don't have to disclose all the companies.
So they just don't have to tell you.
They don't have to tell you anything. Yeah.
They probably are like, oh my God, it's that woman's emailing us again. Because I don't I'll wait like a week or two and then I'll follow up and I'll just checking on this. But yeah, I probably never going to get my answer.
And the way that we find that out sometimes is through lawsuits that are filed against the company,
Right.
and then it'll name a company that
Sure.
Owns them, and it might just be a name, and then we look up the name and try to follow that path, and it'll lead us to a private equity firm.
It really is deep diving. I joke around and I say like, oh, you have to really deep dive with private equity, but you really do.
It's deep diving, but it sounds more complicated than it is. This is really something that anybody in your audience could do. You could do is just spending time trying to piece together the pieces of information and follow the breadcrumbs.
Yeah. No. And that's so important. And that's why I'm so glad you have things like the hospital tracker, which I highly suggest people go on their website, go on PSP and check out this hospital tracker and just know for yourself, right? I guess my last question to you would be the question that I get the most frequently, which is like, people say to me all the time, well, you're not going to be able to do anything about it, Meredith. Who cares? Or, I feel so helpless, etc. What can regular people do? Like, I'm a little not on the regular side in the sense that like I'm obsessed with private equity, but the average person, what can they do to make themselves more aware of private equity and to help push back against this?
There are a few different things that you can do. I'll try and go through different examples, starting with, you mentioned that Senator Warren and Markey had wrote that letter to WellPath. They are also part of a broader group of just federal legislators who are currently scrutinizing private equity in healthcare, both in the Senate and the House. And so if you are engaged with your congresspeople, maybe try to engage with them, see how they're looking into these things. The FTC, the Department of Health, and the Justice Department are also currently looking into private equity in healthcare. On a state level, you could engage with state legislators and policymakers, especially in the prison. A lot of prison contracts and jail contracts are on the state and local level. And then if you are a tenant or a worker or just somebody who is a person of conscience, get involved with an organization that is fighting the bad effects of private equity. So maybe join a tenants association, a patients advocacy group, a union. We're near LAX now, and there are some hotels around LAX that are owned by private equity. And Unite Here Local 11 here in Los Angeles has been really pushing on those hotels. Get involved with other people. And then if you're not really into doing those kinds of things, it is just helpful to read about, learn about, watch videos, listen to podcasts, learn to talk about private equity, because part of what makes it so harmful is that it's in the shadows.
Right.
It's something
It's sneaky.
It's sneaky, right?
It's sneaky.
And so it's the more we talk about it, the more we learn that we can catch them being sneaky. So
I always say, tell a friend to tell a friend.
Tell a friend to tell a friend, and then maybe get your friends together and compare notes, and just keep sharpening your understanding, because that's really what's gonna be key to to fighting the worst effects of private equity, is being able to identify and talk about it, and then engage with the policymakers who can bring accountability and transparency to private equity.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. This has been so helpful. I hate private equity, but I love talking about it. So thank you. And I am sure that everyone who hears this and sees this is going to be so excited. Check out PESP, pesp.org.
PEstakeholder.org.
PEstakeholder.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Thank you. Okay. Welcome to what I think is going to be an incredible segment of Oddly Specific. And that is, we are going to dive into something that is oddly specific that I am obsessed with. And this is actually inspired from a negative Reddit post about me. Do you ever go on Reddit,
Ooh.
Christina?
Occasionally, yes.
Okay. Christina is our guest today, and Christina Catucci is a comedian, a writer, and a occasional Reddit user. So I have banned myself from Reddit.
Okay.
Because I found a lot of negative posts about myself.
Reddit is a cesspool for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And people are just haters on there naturally. I'm sorry that happened.
Thank you. There was this one that was like, I know this is going to be a bad take, but I really can't stand Meredith Lynch. And then, but then like, I actually was happy for this person because like so many people responded and they were like, oh no, I can't stand her either.
Oh my God.
So I was like, oh, you are not alone. But what they said is you know, I can't stand how she remembers these really specific things from years ago. And then she brings them up in like her TikToks. And I was like, wait, that's the bit.
Yeah.
The devil is in the details.
That's also a crazy thing to get mad at someone for, because it's basically being like, I hate you for having a good memory.
Right?
Like, can anyone else not stand this woman who has a good memory?
I can't help the fact that like I remember all of my traumas. Do you have a good memory?
I used to, and then something happened, and I just don't have a good memory anymore.
Okay.
Nothing specific happened. I just like turned 25.
And like
and
it was just like
stopped. Yeah, now I don't remember like events.
Do you remember all the names of your elementary school teachers?
Recently, I started forgetting them, and that was scary. But I'll remember like the really good ones or the really bad ones, because the emotions are tied to the memory.
Yeah. Okay. All right. People will say to me all the time, they're like, I have no idea who taught me second grade. And I'm like, well, that woman comes up in all of my therapy appointments. So
oh no.
Maybe it's better if you don't remember.
Yeah. Yeah. It's either you repressed it and it was really bad, or you don't remember it because it was uneventful.
Yeah. Well, here's one thing that John Mayer wishes I would forget. His relationship with Jessica Simpson. And that is basically what we're going to get oddly specific about today. Did you know, prior to me forcing this topic on you, did you know that John Mayer and Jessica Simpson dated?
Very vaguely, but I did not know it was this crazy.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Jessica Simpson and John Mayer dated. This was after her divorce from Nick Lachey. They dated off and on for a few years because John Mayer is absolutely unhinged and would break up with her like at the most like in the worst ways, by the way. He would like break up with her 5 minutes before she was supposed to go on stage. He would, you know, break up with her over email. It was horrible. But what I was obsessed with was in Jessica Simpson's memoir, Open Book, which is a fantastic book, by the way. She talked about the fact that he tried to make her re-record this song called Walkin' Round in a Circle. So I made Christina listen to Walkin' Around in a Circle. How many times did you listen to it?
So the first time I was like, this can't be real. So I had to listen to it 6 more times in the car.
Okay.
While I listened to it, I had my windows down. I looked insane. I really tried to like it.
Okay.
I tried to be open-minded about it, but I didn't like it.
Okay. Then I admit it's not like the greatest song. It's a little elevator music-y.
Yes.
Then I made you read 4 pages of Jessica Simpson's Open Book where she describes that John Mayer was obsessed with that song and he thought that song was like the key to her career. And he was obsessed with making her re-record it, even though she did not want to. And so could you explain to the audience what ends up happening?
So basically, and unfairly, Jessica is forced by John Mayer to re-record the song so long into the night in New York City that she has some sort of trauma response and snaps and runs outside into the night in New York City as Jessica Simpson, and then has to hide her identity because she's worried people are going to see her. So he pushed her to a breaking point.
Yes.
She had this sort of movie moment that she talks about running down the sidewalk.
I would say any amount of time with John Mayer would lead me to a trauma response. Okay.
Yes.
Firstly, there's that. Okay. But it does seem like he was one of those guys who was like, I can just get you to be the better version of you. And to be fair, the song is actually sampled from a Fleetwood Mac song, Dreams, which is like this incredible Fleetwood Mac song. You're not going to get much better than, you know, pulling from Stevie Nicks.
Right.
But I would say I thought after reading that passage, your opinion of walking around in a circle might change. And so I'm here to ask you that.
I feel like I went from just disliking the song to being afraid of the song.
You're afraid of it
Well,
now?
I was like, oh, this is so sad that this is tied to so much of Jessica Simpson being traumatized by John Mayer. And ironically, the lyrics are walking around in a circle, and that is how it feels to listen to the song. My first, like, right off the bat impression was Sims 3 build mode music. And if anyone knows The Sims, they have basically elevator music, like you were saying, when you do certain things like build houses in The Sims. And it went from Sims 3 build mode music to Jessica Simpson running into the night afraid. So the imagery changed for me.
Wow. It's almost like she was a sim and then she broke free.
That is so true.
Of all of the 90s, like early 2000s pop stars, which one of them do you think is most likely to play Sims?
Ooh, Britney.
You think Britney would play The Sims?
I feel like she has a gamer's spirit.
You think she's a gamer?
I think she is secretly somewhere in there. She
Okay.
seems like a fun person, and The Sims requires being a fun person.
I feel like Britney probably played the video game, the Kim Kardashian one, that was like kind of like Sims.
What was that, like Kim's app, you mean?
Yeah, like it was
Okay.
like a game you could like take Kim to the clubs.
Oh, right. Yes.
I got addicted to that game.
I never played it, but I thought it was such a power move to make a video game of your own life.
If you had a video game about your life, like Kim's was like she would open boutiques and she would go to clubs. What would yours be?
Mine would be scrolling on my phone, going in my car, doing my errands.
Oh, okay, errands.
Mhm.
Like where? Specific stores?
Ooh, I love Target.
Okay.
I love the 99 cents only store, RIP. They're closing.
I know.
Those are where I do most of my errands.
They might be coming back, though.
Okay.
I know.
It was very important to me to go to the 99 cents only store. So when I found out they were specifically closing that establishment, it felt like a personal attack. It's like, someone's doing this to me. Someone doesn't want me to save on my toothpaste.
Do you think that the savings are that good there?
See, the thing is, they are if you stay under $3. For some
Okay.
reason, when you go over $3, they try to get you to pay more. Like some stuff will be $10, $12 for crap.
Okay.
Yeah.
But like it's kind of like you're already there.
Yes, exactly. The
Okay.
convenience of it all, the idea that you might be saving money.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to know where to look.
And it's kind of hard to comparison shop when you're at the 99
Right.
cent store. Yeah.
Totally.
So I believe in justice for Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel on that?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. I think that is all I think that's all I needed to know from you is that you agreed with me on justice for Jessica.
I'm on her side,
especially more so now that we know the backstory of walking around in a circle
Mhm.
and her exposure to John Mayer.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Even her just sitting down and writing that book, I'm already on her side.
Would you read the full book?
Oh, yeah. I thought they were very good excerpts that I read. She seems to have like a good grasp on everything that happened to her and sort of relays it back in an eloquent way.
Right?
So,
I
yeah.
mean, like, it's good writing.
Yeah,
it's
she's good.
really, I mean, obviously she had a ghostwriter.
Yeah.
Like, no offense, justice for Jessica, but Jessica, I'm not going to say you didn't have a ghostwriter.
Her ghostwriter she hired was really good.
Yes, definitely. So I guess what we're going to say is our oddly specific take is justice for Jessica. Listen to Walking Around in a Circle. Just
Yes.
play it once and then play it while knowing that Jessica had to be, overly exposed to John Mayer.
You'll be able to hear the fatigue and it will change you.
Christina, thank you for joining me for my first oddly specific segment.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.